apostles. So let's start in, I'm going to start reading in verse 7. "And proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You receive without paying, give without pay. Acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or a staff, for the laborers deserve his wages." Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your gospel. We thank you that it has gone out into the world, that men took this message on their lips and proclaimed this beautiful message that was more precious than any gold or any fine thing the world might offer, and offer to men eternal life, that they might be reconciled with you. We thank you for the men and women throughout church history who have, in seeking to imitate you and your disciples, have gone forth preaching the gospel. And we pray that you would help us to learn from their example and to benefit from it, even in times when, as at all times, corruption exists in church institutions, and sinners seem to dominate places of power, and secular rulers push the church and wage war against the church, or make uneasy peace with the church. We thank you that faithful men and women have never ceased to love you, and have never ceased to give you praise and to long for you and desire for your coming. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, we're going to begin today by looking at the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages, or one of the, maybe you call it the golden age of Christian history, at least in the Middle Ages. It's the period of the beautiful Gothic cathedrals. It's the period of great works like the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, and also by the poet Dante. So these three things, the cathedrals, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Thomas's Summa Theologica, have sometimes been considered the great masterpieces of the medieval church, the great things they produced. It's said that the cathedrals were really theology in stone. Maybe you could even say the Summa Theologica in stone. Because when you walk into a Gothic cathedral, you're immediately hit by your smallness, your frailty, your weakness, and God's grandeur and greatness as everything soars high above you. You're also reminded of the cross. The church is designed in the very shape of a cross, and right at the center you find the altar. And if you look at the artwork on the side, the stone carvings and the pillars, you're reminded of the great truths of the faith as well. And in the Summa Theologica, we have one of the first great summaries of the Christian faith. I know as Protestants we love our systematic theologies. Well, there's precedents before, but this is one of the central masterpieces of that genre. As well, we see Dante's Great Divine Comedy, which is in some ways learning from Thomas's Summa Theologica and what he taught, and putting it into a poem form and kind of encapsulating all of the classical past, what we saw with pagan Greeks and Romans, as well as what the Christian church had taught, and trying to bring those in together in some form of a synthesis. So it's a beautiful time for the church in many ways. But as we've seen too, we've seen some issues going on. This is a time of things like the Crusades, where we have papal power promoting military endeavors against Muslims in the ancient Near East, or in the Near East. So we've seen some things that have kind of maybe caused us to not view this time so favorably, as well as seeing the power of the popes and how they have sometimes domineered and pushed secular rulers. And we're going to see a little more of that today. But I also hope, as we're seeing these things maybe that we're uncomfortable with, we also see signs of life in the church. We see men and women who loved God and who did seek after Him and who did seek to promote His name. And we're going to begin with probably one of the most, if not the most important figure, kind of at the centerpiece of the High Middle Ages, and that is Innocent III. The papacy, from a top-down reform, trying to reform the clergy, trying to remove the church from the secular ruler's control. He comes the closest. He will make kings and emperors bow to his wishes. Okay, not just once or twice, but multiple times. He will approve some of the most important monastic orders. If you've ever seen the Disney movie or any of the Robin Hood movies, I'm thinking of the Disney Robin Hood movie, and you've seen the figure of Friar Tuck, He's a friar. He's one of the mendicant orders that gets promoted, and Innocent is at the heart of those, or at least promoting them. He also is going to call a crusade, so he's kind of right in line. We've already had the Crusades introduced. He will call the Fourth Crusade, as well as calling a crusade against fellow Christians who are deemed heretics. And then he's going to hold one of the most important church councils, especially in the Middle Ages. So a very important figure, and just remember the name Innocent or Innocent III, because he's going to weave in and out of our story. I will be talking about something and then mention his name, so just keep him in mind as we go forward. So you can go to the next slide. The next one as well, sorry. And one more. All right, so in the High Middle Ages, we get a big change. The early Middle Ages, Europe is kind of, we can maybe think of it as a backwater. The beautiful big cities are all in the east. Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim Empire that stretches now from the where Syria is, all the way down towards India, all along North Africa and into Spain. These are the kind of flourishing urban centers of society. Western Europe does not have those. Now why? Some of the reasons we talked about. We had lots of Viking raids. We had the kind of Hungarian peoples, the Magyars raiding in, as well as Muslim raids, among many other things as well. We don't have agricultural output being as high as it's going to be in the High Middle Ages. So what happens to Western Europe is it kind of contracts and shrinks a little bit. We have small petty kings, nothing really big and flourishing. That all changes around the year 1000. Several things are going to lead to that. So before the year 1000, there were 25 to 30 million people living in Western Europe. We get some agricultural innovations. We don't have time to go into them all, but it is fascinating. One important one is the horse collar. Before that, you had the, what's it called, for oxen to yoke, the oxen yoke. There we go. Anyway, this would pull against the windpipe of horses, and they could not pull the plow as fast. The collar allowed the weight to go off of the neck and onto the shoulders of the horse, and a horse could pull, at least certain ones, much faster than an oxen could. The iron plow also allows them to dig deeper into soil, or soil they previously could not dig into, so they're able to expand the amount of land that's under cultivation, as well as doing things like creating a three-field system where you have one field with nothing in it, it's fallow. You have another one that has some kind of grain or wheat, and another one that has some kind of bean or oat or legume or something like this. And this allows the soil to refresh itself, to put things back into the soil with the legumes and other things. So things like this are going to increase the agricultural output quite a bit in the early High Middle Ages. This allows a couple important things. Sustain a larger population. You got more food now, you can feed more people. Okay? As well as you have a surplus. You have to do something with it. You can trade it now. Okay? The population is going to increase in 300 years to about 50 to 100 million. So that's at least doubling, if not more. That's astronomical growth during this time. Okay, we can go to the next slide. The next thing this leads to is the return of towns. I said cities in the slide, but towns may be better, more appropriate. Before the year 1000, there were very few towns in Western Europe. The places you did have some were in northern Italy. Northern Italy never fully leaves town life, as most of Western Europe does. Most of Western Europe goes to kind of rural estates run by a lord who has serfs that live on the estate and farm part of it for him. But maybe a big town is about 10,000 to 20,000 in Italy. Maybe in Northern Europe it would be about 4 to 5. So very, very, very small towns. But with the agricultural revolution, we have a population increase. And with more people, we have people beginning to move to cities. This allows for more specialized trades. You could think of all the typical trades you'd find in a town normally. Blacksmiths, all those kind of things. But also merchants and eventually bankers. They're going to come back onto the scene as well. Another important result of the return of cities is the increase in literacy and numeracy. So you have more people now because they're on a day-to-day basis involved in monetary transactions. They're involved signing contracts and writing contracts. They need to be able to read and write and to count and do basic arithmetic. So literacy and numeracy are going to increase. Now this is an important point to understand before we get to something like the Reformation. Without this increase, when you have the printing press producing stuff in mass, there would be no audience for it if this had not happened. So this is kind of one of those important, small, kind of maybe easily overlooked steps that's important for that. We can skip the merchants and trade fairs. But Europe becomes kind of connected more with the East now through our next slide, which is the commercial revolution. So remember, we've just gone to the Crusades, the First Crusade in 1092. So the Western Europe has now come back into contact more fully. The Italians never fully had left that contact, but now the Franks and others come back into contact with the East, okay? They get introduced to Eastern goods while they are fighting at the Crusades, and they return home, and there's a desire for that market to continue and to increase. So the Italian merchants, by and large, I'll show you a map in a second, begin to establish a trade route through Constantinople, through other places as well with Muslims, that even extends all the way into China. If you know Marco Polo, he is an Italian merchant. He goes all the way to China. So that's all kind of connected in here. So that's an important thing as well. Why is it important we're connecting with these? Not just for like we're getting spices we didn't have, but we're also going to be introduced to ideas that had kind of disappeared from the West. Writings such as Aristotle's works will kind of begin to come back in to the church. And some of the other church fathers and things will begin to come back into the church as well. Okay? Also, we have an increase in wealth and prosperity. We get a kind of a new class of people, the townsmen, or the burgher, as they're often called. So these townspeople now, again, they're more literate. Often, some of them at least, are going to be more wealthy. They're not basing their monetary stability on the land like the nobility would. The nobility would have a big farm, essentially, a big villa, with people helping them work it. These people have gotten rich through trade and things. Now, they may now own land, but that's how they originally got wealthy, was through trade. Also, this may not seem important either, but a money economy. Previously, it was done essentially on a barter system. So if I have some goods that I make and you have some things I want, we kind of figure out what is a good trade and we switch over and trade. Now the introduction of money, now I begin to think about making a profit, okay, when I am trading things. So I can not just get a one-for-one transaction. I got what I put into it and got it back and I make no money. Now I begin to think about making a profit off of that money. Also now, it's much different. Now merchants can do what? They can carry a box of gold with them, rather than a huge caravan of goods. And they can go to markets and buy things and trade for them and bring them back. So different age, and this will play into something we see with the mendicant orders later. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, here is kind of if you want to look at the trade markets here. So the east to west market mainly runs through these Italian city-states. They will become very, very wealthy. Really the first coin that we have of any significance come into the play is called the florin, named after the city of Florence, an Italian city-state. Because these are very wealthy and were very wealthy before, the Holy Roman Emperor, who'd be located in this area, always is fighting over control of northern Italy. And the Pope also is trying to keep him out of northern Italy. If you see this trade, this north to south trade, we get the Italian city-states connected to the northern Europe as well. And you can just look at all those dots. Those are all cities and towns. Okay, so we've increased to a large number of cities after the year 1300. Okay, all right, we can go to the next slide. All right, another thing that kind of crops up in here too, because of a lot of these other things, is the rise of medieval universities. Okay, before this, education was done one of two ways, maybe three, through monastic houses. So monks would have a school where they would maybe teach some of the local boys and other people, so they could have people to eventually become monks potentially. Or you would be trained through a cathedral school. So cathedral is from a Latin word that means seat. It's where the bishop's seat or throne is, where he's his primary church that he resides at. There will be a school attached to that, so it's a cathedral school. And it was free education for those pursuing a job in the ministry, essentially. And then maybe we could also look at some of the courts, the king's courts and things like this, and you could find some kind of education there as well. But the university begins to emerge, in large part, to answer several different things. We now need educated people to be able to run these markets and to engage in all the trade that's going on. And also there's a desire for it. Now, because we have these contracts being made between these various cities and merchants, we also now have more need for law as far as signing of contracts. So think of like a lawyer that works with like real estate type things today. So that becomes a big thing. So we get the secular law being a very important thing that you go to school for. There are actually only three major, or kind of very important degrees: law, and that could be church law, canon law, or state law, medicine, and then theology. Those are the three like major degrees. So there were no other degrees for anything else. There was kind of a bachelor's degree before that of the arts, which would be the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then you could go on to more advanced in the quadrivium. Okay. The first universities we get are in 1200 with Paris, Bologna in 1158. Paris is known for its theology program, and Bologna is known for its law programs. If you want to get a job in law or get a law degree, Bologna is the place to go. And then also, just a few you would know, Cambridge and Oxford, those are established around the 12th and 13th century. Now, some of these began before this, but this is when they were chartered. All right, so by 1300, over 20 universities established in Europe. So again, we've had a lot happen, a lot change from about the year 1000 to about the year 1300, okay? There's totally different demographics now. We have a whole new group of people we didn't really formally have, which are townspeople. We have a higher rate of literacy and education. We now have universities that train people to be specialized in certain jobs. And a lot of our important theologians are going to study at these universities as well. And now we have a lot of towns as well. We can go to the next, go to the next one as well. All right. Now, we're going to talk now about the mendicant orders. The word mendicant is from a Latin word that means to beg. So these are I don't know if they would want to be called monks. I think some of them resent that. I'm not sure. But they're kind of like a monastic order. So if you think about the monks we've seen, they're kind of like that, but they're a little bit different. And you'll see why in a minute. But they, per their name, beg for their survival. Okay? All right, we can go to the next one. So we've created this new kind of demographic in Western Europe. How are we going to minister to these townspeople? They're a little bit different than the kind of rural peasantry and the rural nobles. They engage in business every day. They're used to haggling and debating for what they want all the time, trying to get the best deal possible. Towns decrease the amount of privacy to some extent you could have. You're kind of in a very small place and everybody kind of knows your business to some degree, including the priest who you're supposed to do what to? Confess to. Okay, and if you trust him, that's all great, but if you don't, you're afraid that his mouth is a little loose. You know, everybody's going to know what you did last Saturday at the country fair. That wouldn't be good. So we've got a little bit of also different kind of maybe vices. If we're thinking about the nobles, we'd say pride. That's their besetting sin. Okay, that's the way the moralists of the time would describe it. If we're thinking about the townspeople, what's their besetting sin? Greed. Okay, lack of faith in God. Why? They're always planning out their next business endeavor, their next move, their next trip, so they can engage in business. They always are dealing with coins. This is a new thing. The average peasant doesn't deal with coins ever. Now you've got men that are doing what on a daily basis? Exchanging coins back and forth. Okay, always trying to make a profit, trying to figure out what the best deal is. Okay, so the moralists of the time would accuse them of greed and also presumption for failing to trust God. They don't trust God. They're always trying to, guess what tomorrow brings rather than trusting in the Lord. Now, think about the monks that we've had. They are removed from the world. They live in the rural areas. Okay, they have their own estates out in the country. They view what? Contact with the world to some degree as a very big temptation to sin. Okay, it could mar you. So you want to do what? Stay separate from it. Okay. So now we've got this new people, we need to minister to them. Probably the last people that are going to be any good at it are those people because they're going to go in and think that these townspeople are very wicked, very sinful. Okay? So there's a need there. And by the way, I think we've seen to some extent from our last lecture, and maybe we'll see it again today, but there is dissatisfaction, not all across the board, but in individual cities you would find dissatisfaction with local priests. Again, in a town, one of the issues is going to be, I don't want to confess to my priest, okay? Maybe because he might, bring it up or something like this. At times, there's dissatisfaction because the priest was not carrying out his duty of instruction, which included preaching. There are times where cities will complain about that and ask for the priest to be removed. Other times, it could be for charging for services, which was somewhat accepted, but exorbitantly charging was not. So there is dissatisfaction. So the people want to see, I guess we could say, holiness, and they sometimes don't find it in their local priest. That is not always the case. I don't want to paint that picture either, okay? There are good men that are being priests at the time, as well as bad men. Same today, okay? But there is some dissatisfaction at times. Now, also think about, if you have a higher increased amount of literacy, the people are more intelligent as far as knowing what's going on, as far as maybe they can read and they can maybe even know a little Latin and know what the Bible says or something like this. There's going to be maybe a little discrepancy if the priest isn't educated, which often was the case. Now, why were some priests not educated? Well, we saw this last week with the holding of church offices. If you held a church office, it came with a what? A price. It benefited you. It came with a payment. Okay? You got some of the tithes just for being that bishop or that priest. Okay? Well, there became a very bad practice where you could hold multiple offices. So I could be the pastor of Church X in, let's just say, Jackson. But then I'm also the bishop in East Tennessee over 10 churches. But I'm also maybe a canon priest somewhere in Nashville. All right, I can't possibly fulfill all my duties to those various places, okay? This is called absenteeism, where the bishop does not actually do his job. He holds multiple offices. So what often would they do? They would pay some local that probably wasn't always educated to do the job. They wouldn't pay them a lot either, okay? So sometimes you'd have very uneducated clergymen, sometimes that really couldn't even read the Latin text to say the Mass, kind of fulfilling a job. So if you're a layman and you're looking to the church for salvation and it's laying a big rotten egg, you're wanting help from somewhere else. So you got that going on too. And that leads us to our next slide, because that primes the people to want to look for something else. Okay? They want to see holiness lived out. They want to see godly men living godly lives and teaching. They don't see this dissonance between what they teach and what they say. They also want to hear men who know the faith and can expound upon it. So we end up seeing during this time, more than this, but here are two of the kind of heretical, and I put a question mark, you'll see why in a second, sects that emerge in Western Europe at the time. The first one that we definitely can say are heretical. There's nothing we really want to say too much in favor of them, maybe besides a few things. They're known as the Cathars. Okay, that means something like the pure. They had teachers who lived, the perfect, who lived lives of kind of poverty. They renounced marriage. They renounced sexual intercourse. They abstained from any food produced by sexual intercourse. They were like vegans before it was cool, I guess. Is it cool? I don't think. It may not be. Anyway, I don't think it is cool, but anyway, I like meat too much. Anyway, then you had a lesser class, kind of the believers, who were kind of, they didn't want to renounce all those things. They didn't want to live exactly to the same strictures as the others did. What did they teach? So they lived a life that people could look at and say, maybe we would disagree to some extent, but at the time, they would look at these people and say, you're just like the monks. You live these very godly lives. We could never live this life. Okay, so they respect it. But they believe they're essentially a Gnostic sect that teaches the physical creations of the world was made evil and it was made by Satan. And Satan is an equal power to God. So it's God who's equal and Satan, they're equal. This kind of heresy props up off and on. Augustus originally believed in something that taught something very similar to this, okay? A duality of good and evil. They taught that the soul that you have was a kidnapped angelic spirit that was placed into a body upon its birth. And that's one of the reasons they don't like sexual reproduction, because you're just giving the devil more bodies to put souls into, okay? They thought sexual reproduction was the greatest sin. Christ did not have a body, and he didn't die, and therefore didn't rise again, okay? And salvation came through spiritual enlightenment. Okay, we saw this in the early church. If you remember, if you have watched those lectures, that's there as well. All right, and they also believe they were the true church. The Latin church or the Roman church, these are false believers, and they are destined for hell, I guess we could say. All right, so that's one group. Definitely heretics. The next group are called Waldensians, after a guy with the last name Valdez or Waldez. Sometimes he's called Peter Waldo. That's probably not actually his real name, but that gets added later. He is a wealthy French merchant. Okay. Now, usually the monastic class, not always, but a lot of them did come from noble families. Not all the time, but a lot of the ones we'll see do. So he's from a wealthy French merchant family. He reads Matthew 19:21, where Jesus tells the rich young ruler to sell all that he has and give to the poor. He reads it. He takes it literally. It's kind of the same story as St. Anthony, the first kind of monk in the desert. And he gives away all his possessions. And then he begins to travel around to all the different places to meet the people and to preach. Okay? People like this, right? You've got this man coming in. He's teaching. It seems like he knows what he's talking about. He goes to the Pope, Alexander III. He's trying to remain within the church at this point. And the Pope says, I like what you're doing, but I just can't have laymen going around preaching. This is a more nuanced topic, but generally, laymen were not supposed to preach. Okay? So he actually says, sorry, you can't form an order. You don't need to do this. Stop. Forbids him to preach. Well, I'm going to call him Peter Waldo. Waldez says no, and he continues to preach. He gets a band of followers that go with him, and they live lives of poverty. So they've renounced their goods. People, again, respect this kind of life. They go around teaching and preaching. Even many people that don't join them officially, but are still part of the Roman church, respect them and even harbor them when they would come through. They would hide them so they would not get caught by the officials. After their excommunication, notice some of the things they begin to shed. They begin to uphold the importance of reading of the vernacular, so reading of the Bible in their own language, and emphasizing the importance of the New Testament for the life of the church. Okay? Here's some things they reject. Papal authority on that basis. Transubstantiation, which we'll talk about later. Purgatory, prayers to the dead, indulgences, and some more things. They will survive as a movement for a time until what's called the Albigensian Crusade that we'll talk about in a moment. And they will be forced out to northern Italy, where eventually they will essentially assimilate into the Protestant movement of the Reformation. So the church condemns them as heretics at a council in 1215. But I think we can see a lot of good that they're trying to do. They're seeing some issues going on. They see some problems in the church, and they begin to search the Scriptures for themselves, begin to promote reading of the Scriptures in the vernacular, and then begin to reject many of the teachings that have kind of accumulated over time. So they're, in some ways, a forerunner to the Protestant movement. Okay? All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, well, now we've got these issues. We've got the new ministry sphere of the town. We've got these heresies popping up, and the townspeople being attracted to them. You can understand why. They're like, well, that's what we wanted. Okay? Who maybe cares to some extent what they're teaching, or maybe don't fully understand it. They're persuasive. Okay, I'll believe it. Well, then we get a guy by the name of St. Francis. He's probably one of the only Roman Catholic saints we see on a regular basis, because if you drive to any subdivision and you look into any, maybe every 10 yards, you will find a bird bath with St. Francis of Assisi holding it up. So anyway, if you see a guy that looks like that holding a bird bath, that's him. Now, he also is the son of a wealthy Italian cloth merchant. Okay? See a pattern between him and Valdez, or Waldo? He renounces his inheritance and impoverishes himself. Part of the story goes like this. One day he was out selling cloth for his father, kind of going to take the family business. He's practicing, I guess, as a young man. And he sees a beggar. And he runs after the beggar and gives him everything in his pockets and empties it out and gives it to him because he's so moved by the man's need. His friends all rebuke him and laugh at him. And his father rebukes him for doing what? Getting rid of his money and merchandise. It's really his father's, right? Also later on, Francis will want to help rebuild a chapel in the area that's kind of fallen down. He believes that God has, in a vision, told him to rebuild this chapel. And he will go and begin to sell his father's cloth to get money to rebuild the cloth. His father, of course, is not happy about this. He's enraged. He actually locks him up in the house in a room for a long time, and his mother eventually lets him out. Father's wrath, mother's mercy, I guess. Lets him out, and then his father brings him before the bishop and the local officials and essentially wants to get him disinherited because he's clearly not following in the family footsteps, clearly is taking his inheritance and squandering it, as the father views here. And Francis, in the middle, allegedly, of this kind of court, says, fine. He says, essentially, I guess I'll renounce my inheritance, and I guess by implication his father, and he takes off his clothes and says, here, this you gave me too, and he walks out, and the bishop quickly puts his cloak around him as he walks out. Whether that story is actually true or not, it makes for a fun story. But it does get at who he is, right? He's willing to give up everything, in some sense, do what he thinks necessary to follow Christ, even to doing something like that. He's not the only one, by the way, that did something like that in church history. Origen, kind of did something like his father had been martyred, and he wanted to essentially follow in his father's footsteps, and his mother did not want him to. So she actually takes his clothes and hides them, and he actually doesn't go out because of shame for, appearing without clothes in public, but didn't stop Francis. All right, now, so what does he do after this initial kind of moment? He essentially goes around and rebuilds churches, like literally, like not Habitat for Humanity. What's the Kingdom? I can't think of it, but the Kingdom Builders program where you go to different places around the world and you help build churches and orphanages and things like that. He does something kind of like that. He goes around trying to raise money, sometimes blocks at a time, and trying to rebuild churches, literally, chapels and churches. Well, at some point after that, a couple years after that, he reads Matthew 10:7-10, the passage that I read at the beginning of our lecture. And there he sees the disciples sent out, and they're told not to take an extra cloak, not to take any gold with them, but to go preach the gospel. And he takes this to, they're doing this in poverty, and they are going out, they're not being luxurious and elaborate, they don't even take gold, and they trust God, to provide for them. So he decides he will do this. So he goes around taking very little with him. And essentially, for his daily needs, he requires people to be kind and give him alms, to give him bread or to give him food if he gets it for that night or not. And he's going around and he's teaching and he's preaching to the people. Okay? He's trying to, in all this, to trust God. He was not a great organizer. He thought that was in some ways to not trust God, I think, to some extent, or at least he wasn't good at it and didn't want to do it. There's a story about some Franciscans who, when they wanted to decide what they were going to do for the day, would essentially twirl around until they got dizzy and fell over, and wherever their head was pointing when they came to, I guess, they would say, that direction. We'll trust the Lord and we'll go. Another story of some Franciscans, they decided to go on a missionary journey to Germany, and they didn't know any German. They said, it's fine, we'll trust the Lord. And they go in, and they don't know any German. They start to get hungry because nobody knows what to do with them. And finally, maybe I guess it happens like this, where somebody's like, are you hungry? And they learn a word like, ja, yes. Like, okay, all right, we'll give you some food. And then, okay, we know that word, it helps out, And then eventually, apparently, the authorities come and say, all right, are you guys heretics here? What are you doing? And they're like, ja. And they're like, all right, get in jail. They beat them, and they send them home. Later on, they do actually learn German and go back. But this whole idea of like, we're just going to trust God. Now, we can maybe look at that as some ways as immature and childish, but at the same time, we can see that as a good thing, this childlike faith, maybe here carried to an extreme, but at the heart of it, something good. In 1210, Pope Innocent III, remember I told you he's going to come in and out of our story, Francis comes to him and asks for approval to form a new religious order, and the Pope gives his approval. Now, he remembered his predecessor, who looked at Peter Waldo, remember, and was like, no, don't preach. He's like, okay, we messed up on that one. We're going to get this one, okay? So now you're going to see the Franciscans go all throughout Western Europe, teaching the people. Also, they'll be given authority to be confessors. So you can actually go to a Franciscan and confess your sins to him. And they were also known to be like the people, and they would bargain with you about what your penance would be. They would probably give you a less harsh, at least it was thought, many people like going to them for that reason, they would give you a less harsh punishment for your penance. When you confess, I did X, and they say, okay, well, do 100 Hail Marys and, crawl on your knees up the steps of the church or something. Well, you might say, well, what about 50? And they're like, 75. Like, deal. And it probably wasn't like that, but they would bargain with people about what their penance would be. So they're going to be one of the great arms at ministering to the townspeople. And they're also going to provide what? Kind of this opposite picture of some of these heretics that we saw, and even some of the Waldensians as well. And they're going to defend the teaching of the church and be faithful to that teaching. Francis also, now think about this, he's a humble guy, this is something that I would never probably think to do. He decides he wants to go meet with the Sultan of Egypt himself, like right around the time of a crusade. He actually goes and meets and tours around Egypt and meets face to face with the Sultan and tries to convert him. Okay, so you've got Christians trying to convert Muslims here. He's very sincere in trying to do that. So we see them engaging in those kind of missionary activities as well. All right, later the story of the Franciscan kind of takes a not so great turn. Francis is very insistent on the rule of poverty. We should not own anything. But what happens, we saw this with other monastic orders, when they start doing well and people respect them, what do? Start supporting them financially. Here's a church, here's a house, here's some money. Francis was so opposed to money that at one point one of his followers picked up a gold coin that somebody had thrown at them. I don't even know if he was wanting to keep it. And Francis essentially, now this is going to sound pretty horrific. Probably if we want to find anything good, it would be the idea he's trying to teach him humility, I guess. But he has him go insert it into cow manure with his teeth. Because he's essentially trying to say, we will not be touching that stuff. Okay? Now maybe that is definitely an extreme example. But we've been critiquing to some extent the wealth and extremity of people living in lavishness. So maybe the answer is somewhere in between. But nonetheless, that's his kind of opposition to money. So he wanted them to remain beggars and to trust in God. Well, later you will get two factions in the Franciscans, the spiritual Franciscans and the conventual Franciscans. The spiritual Franciscans insist on absolute poverty. We want nothing. That's what Francis said. That's what we want to do. It becomes a big debate and a big fight, and eventually the spiritual Franciscans lose. The Pope will eventually condemn them. But while they're being condemned, there was some teaching going around by a certain guy, and essentially said there are these three ages, the age of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And we live in the age of the Spirit now. And in the age of the Spirit, around the year 1260, a new monastic order will rise up, will evangelize the whole world and turn the whole world into a monastery. Okay, people loving, praying to God, these kind of things. Okay, this is about that time that they are condemned, is around that time. So they begin to see themselves as that new monastic order that's going to come do what? Kind of reach the whole world. It's going to make the whole world a monastery. But they will be denounced by Pope John XXII. He will condemn them. They denounce him. You ready for this? You're used to this rhetoric if you studied the Reformation, as the Antichrist. By the way, the Waldensians also kind of threw some of that language around, so these things are already brewing. And then they will be hunted down and largely eliminated by the Inquisition, which is going to get started around this time too. So that's how they end as far as the spiritual Franciscans, but they are still currently a mendicant order today, and they still exist. And many great theologians, many great individuals throughout church history will be Franciscans. All right, let's go to the next slide. Our next group of mendicant friars, and by the way, friar means something like brother, so the Dominicans and the Franciscans are friars or brothers, is by a guy named Dominic. He lives in Spain, and he goes to southern France where the Cathar heretics are, and I'm going to call them the Albigensians, or the Albigensian heretics now. He goes there to preach to them, but he goes with the kind of the current way that he is. He's a canon priest. He goes with his bishop and others, and he realizes we are very ineffective at trying to reach these people. We can't compete with them. He says we need to fight fire with fire. So he decides he's going to found an order of preachers who are going to vow poverty as well. So they will live just like, in many ways, these other heretics do by giving away all wealth. But also, they are going to study, and they are going to be able to defend the teaching of the church and be able to refute heretics. So the Dominicans are an order of preaching friars. And he will try to found this order, and he goes to Pope Innocent III in 1215 and asks for approval. He actually does not get approval here initially. He has to wait a little bit. Pope Innocent dies shortly after this. But Pope Innocent does approve of what they are doing. He just doesn't want to add another order because there's been several at this time. Later on, they will be given the rights to preach everywhere, which is kind of a rare privilege to be given. They're known for being kind of the warriors versus the heretics. They're known for being great academics. Thomas Aquinas is a Dominican friar. Okay, he's kind of the pinnacle of all, maybe one of the greatest minds of all the church. R.C. Sproul would say he would put 5 of his greatest theologians, Augustine, Calvin, Luther, Jonathan Edwards, and Thomas Aquinas. And he would say, Augustine, Calvin, and Luther are the best in these areas. He says as far as being the brightest mind and most intelligent, he said he couldn't pick between Edwards and Aquinas. So very important thinker here. All right, so they will eventually become the staff members of the Inquisition. Okay, so they'll be the ones that will be in charge largely of the Inquisition. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to look more at some issues involving Pope Innocent III and church and state. So let's go to the next one. Okay, how did Innocent view the papacy? He's kind of the high point of the Roman papacy. Okay, we saw in a previous lecture, we looked at Gregory VII. We saw that he tried to, or did to initially, oppose the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. He made him do penance before him 3 days in the snow before a castle, before then receiving him back into the church. And later on, we saw him then run out of Rome by the same emperor and dying in exile. But nonetheless, he made some pretty exalted claims. He said the emperor or the pope has the right to depose emperors. Okay, we're going to get even more exalted claims here. So here's what Innocent believes. He believes that the papacy is not just the vicar of Peter, the representative of Peter on the earth, but the vicar of Christ. Not only that, the vicar of God. Now, that title we talked about when we talked about sacred kingship. The Carolingian Empire and other kings thought that what? They were the vicar of God. Now, God would include the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And they would even concede, and you, the Pope, can be the vicar of Christ, but we are the vicar of the whole triune God, you just the Son. So they would say the emperor is greater than the Pope. Well, notice what he's doing here. He's saying, I am the vicar of God. I am the most important authority on earth. And it would seem, there's a little bit of debate here, he would include that in temporal realm too, not just the spiritual realm, but also the temporal realm. There's a little bit of debate there how far he goes, but pretty high claim. Here's what he says. The Lord Jesus Christ has established one sovereign, the Pope, over all his universal vicar, or as his universal vicar, whom all things in heaven, earth, and hell should obey, even as they bow the knee to Christ. It's a pretty bold statement there. Now, this view, of course, is going to bring him into some great conflicts with the kings and emperors of Europe. And we'll go to our next slide to see that. All right, so the first one is the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember, the Holy Roman Emperor essentially, I think, Germany. After the Concordat of Worms, we talked about that last week, where they agreed that the church can give the bishop or priest or the abbot his spiritual authority. So they give him the ring and they give him the shepherd's crook to show his spiritual authority. But the king or the emperor gives him his temporal authority. They kind of made a concession there, an agreement. But this really never is fully resolved. It's only really a stalemate rather than, I guess, a peace. Well, after that, in 1122, what we essentially have, to cut a lot of things short, is a back and forth between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope wants to keep the Holy Roman Emperor out of Italy, but this gets even more complicated when the Holy Roman Emperor at the time inherits Sicily and Naples. So if you want to, I'll draw it over here. I'm very good at drawing maps. You can ask my students, but there's Italy. Okay. All right, there's the Alps. Okay, Rome, it's right here. Sicily is a little island here. That's more or less what it really looks like if you look at it, from space. Down here is the kingdom of Naples and Sicily. Now up here beyond the Alps is the Holy Roman Empire, Germany. The Holy Roman Emperors are always trying to control all these city-states in the north here. Rome has its little sliver of land, the Papal States, kind of in the center. Well, now Rome's effectively surrounded by the Holy Roman Emperors. This is really bad. So the popes are going to now try to connive and do whatever they can to get the Holy Roman Emperors out of southern Italy, and so they're not surrounded. Well, something happens in 1197. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI suddenly dies. He has an heir, but his heir is very young, too young to rule. His heir is Frederick II. The queen, widow now, of Henry VI goes to the Pope and says, listen, will you take my son as your charge? Will you protect him and essentially help him to inherit his thrones in Sicily and Naples in southern Italy? So he takes him as his charge. So now think about this. He's got essentially a potential claimant to the Holy Roman Empire as his personal charge. A lot of power there. Also, during this time, a civil war breaks out. Two claimants to the throne. Otto of Brunswick and Philip of Swabia begin to fight a civil war. The Pope throws his support behind Otto. Why? Otto says, listen, I'll give up all my claims to Rome. I'll give up all my claims to a lot of the things around Italy. I'll even give you complete control of the churches in Germany. None of this lay investor stuff. You get to have complete control. And the Pope's like, you got it. So he sides with him. By the way, like the day after he is crowned, when he kind of becomes victorious by the Pope, he's like, yeah, I didn't really mean all that stuff I told you. I'm not going to do any of it. So then the Pope does what? Excommunicates him. Otto, now the Holy Roman Emperor, is now excommunicated. All right, that's here. Now, Otto is eventually going to go and try to help out King John. Right, go back to the Robin Hood Disney movie, right? You know the little lion? That's King John. Okay. Richard the Lionheart's brother who takes over his throne. Okay, King John now has inherited a massive kingdom. And he will now come into conflict with the French crown for various reasons. The French crown is actually his lord. It's a weird situation. And the Pope will now support Philip over supporting John, and Otto helps John. So John and Otto together, the Pope supporting the French king. The French king will win. Otto will eventually die after losing this battle. He'll be killed, and now he's gone. The Pope, remember, has this charge, Frederick II, in his back pocket, who he's now going to put forward as what? The new Holy Roman Emperor. He's essentially made this boy, now a man, become the next Holy Roman Emperor. It will actually not happen during his lifetime. There will be another civil war that's fought, but Frederick II will eventually become the Holy Roman Empire. But what I want you to notice is this, that the Pope is at the center of all these kind of things, all these intrigues, these kind of civil wars, temporal battles between kings, between rival claimants to a throne. And what is this going to do to the Holy Roman Empire? Very important. It's going to permanently weaken and fragment the Holy Roman Empire. It's made up of several large kingdoms now. It's about to be made up of hundreds of small kingdoms and cities. Some of the cities run by secular lords, some are run by bishops. When we get to the Reformation, we'll see these kind of dynamics play out a little bit more. What does it do for Rome? It actually buys Rome independence for a lot longer. The Papal States will stay intact until the 19th century, until 18, maybe 70s, when the Italians unify the Italian peninsula. That will be the end of the Papal States. So think about that. We're talking really from 1200 to about 1800, almost 1900, the Papal States stay as they are, largely because of what happens here. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, there's the line I've been telling you about. That's King John. Okay? All right, so two contests that Innocent gets in. We'll tell these somewhat quickly. This is Philip Augustus, okay? He is going to be one of the greatest French kings. He's going to help the French kings to become powerful and strong. He has a wife that he decides he doesn't like, and he wants to put her away. He gets her accused of essentially making him impotent because she engaged in witchcraft. Guess you got to go at something, I guess, if you're desperate. And she's sent away, and he takes another wife. Okay? Well, this is not morally right, and the Pope knows it's not morally right, and he says, you can't do that. You have to send your new wife away, and you have to take back your first wife. There were no grounds for divorce. Okay? Well, the king now stands across from the Pope and says, I'm not going to do it. So what does the Pope do? The Pope imposes interdict. Now, what is interdict? Interdict is essentially a cessation of the basic services of the sacraments in the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? So we're not going to do Mass anymore. Okay? We're not going to do baptisms, except for in the case of emergencies, like when an infant was going to die. We're not going to do marriages. We will do last rites. That's one of the few exceptions. So if somebody's dying, you go and say their last rites. That's one of the 7 Roman Catholic sacraments. But for the most part, church activities cease. Now, this is very important for the medieval church. You've essentially excluded them from the very grace of God that they believe they're getting through the sacraments. Okay? And also some of the most important markers of life, baptism when you're born and marriage, are gone. So what begins to happen is the people begin to get very upset, and this puts pressure on the king. Well, actually what does happen is Philip's wife dies, and after she dies, he then submits to the authority of the Pope. He takes back his first wife, and the Pope removes the interdict here. So what just happened? The Pope looked a secular ruler in the eye and said, you can't do what you're doing, and he eventually succumbs and obeys. Now, an even more dramatic example is King John. John has a bishop in Canterbury that dies. The archbishopric in Canterbury makes their own archbishop. John says, no, I don't want that man. I want my man. And he puts his man in charge. The Pope comes in and says, both elections are illegal. He says, now you must put my man in, a guy by the name of Stephen Langton. John refuses. He says, you're not going to do that. This is my kingdom. This is back to the deal of lay investiture. This is my kingdom. I'll put my man in charge. And the Pope says, no, you don't have authority to do that. That's my right and authority as the Pope. Well, John's refused. So what happens? Kingdom of England is placed under interdict, okay, for 6 years. He refuses for 6 years. And there's no marriages, no baptisms, no sacraments, no taking the Lord's Supper. 6 years. Finally, after, I guess, being patient, he excommunicates John in 1213. Now, this is important. If you are excommunicated, you are now considered outside the church. And if you're a king, this, according to the Catholic teaching at the time, would absolve all your servants and those under you from their ties to you. Also, it can make you eligible to have a crusade proclaimed against your kingdom, as we'll see in a minute. So the French king actually is preparing a crusade against the kingdom of England to take out John. Okay? John's not excommunicated. He realizes, okay, I've made a big gaffe here. And he goes to Rome. He gives himself up to the Pope, surrenders. Now listen to this. The Pope says, okay, fine. You will become my servant. I will become your Lord. So he is a vassal of the Pope in Rome. The Pope technically owns all of the lands of the whole kingdom of England now. So John, by the way, loses a lot of land to the French, and now he's lost the rest of his kingdom to the Pope. He's lost everything. So John will submit himself to the Pope in 1213. By the way, world history comes in. Magna Carta is signed in 1215. The Pope actually does not like Magna Carta because this is imposed weakening one of his vassals, and he actually rejects it at a council in 1215. Just interesting historical side note. All right, next slide, please. All right, now the Crusades. We'll pick those back up. All right, go to the next slide here. Innocent III calls for the Fourth Crusade. In the year 1187, a guy by the name of Saladin, a Muslim leader, captures Jerusalem back from the Christians. Okay? The First Crusade, we saw Jerusalem be captured. The Second Crusade was a terrible disaster. The Third Crusade is a crusade to get back Jerusalem. Okay? Innocent calls for a crusade in the year 1202. This will be the fourth one. And its main goal is to capture Jerusalem as well as getting Egypt. Okay, a little bit different goal there. All the Crusaders were French, and they come through and they end up in North Italy in Venice because the Venetians are going to essentially give them a passage in their ships over to the Holy Land. The problem is the French don't have enough money to pay them. So the Venetians say, listen, okay, you don't have enough money to pay us. We don't want our reputation to be, kind of tarred because we didn't carry you to the Holy Land because we wanted some money. So we tell you what, let's make a deal. There's a city that just left our kingdom and went over to the Christian kingdom of Hungary. They seceded from us. We'd like them back. So I tell you what, on the way to the Holy Land, just hop out of the boats, take this city for us, return it to Venetian control, and we'll call it even. Some of them agree, enough of them agree. And they take a Christian kingdom, okay? Think about this. This is a crusade against the Muslims to take back the Holy Land. They are now going to stop and attack a Christian kingdom and take that city, okay? So something's gone horribly awry. The Pope, when he hears about this, actually excommunicates. He did not intend this. He excommunicates the Crusaders. Their leaders say, well, that's probably not best to tell the men. Let's wait on that one a little bit. And they don't tell them. Well, they start to make their way to the Holy Land. And on the way, there is a deposed Byzantine emperor that's kind of waiting on the edges saying, listen, I would really like to get back into the throne here. I'd really like to be in control again. How about you guys support me and help me take back the throne? They eventually agree to. He agrees to pay all their debts and things like this. And we're going to make this really short. Long story short, they end up conquering, capturing, and sacking Constantinople. A small kingdom is formed, a Latin kingdom. So now the Byzantine Empire, at least part of it, is now run by the Western kingdoms. So we now have a Latin kingdom in the Byzantine Empire, and it will last for about 50 years or so. This is going to really be the final straw that will sever ties between the East and the West. We talked about the Great Schism last week. This is going to make it not possible to bring back together. Now, Innocent III didn't like this, but after the fact, he's like, well, I guess it was God's will that he bring them back because now the church is united, right? Forcibly united, back under one. So I guess I'll put my stamp of approval on it after the fact, though I don't condone any of the violence. All right, we go to the next one. The next crusade is the first crusade that's proclaimed against a Christian kingdom itself. We're running short on time, so we'll just hit this one briefly. The Albigensians, who were the Cathar heretics, their powers in southern France, and after a long time of patience, the Pope finally says, I think it's important that we regain this territory for Christianity. We've got a lot of people being misled by these heretics, and the local nobility are not willing to help at all. So he excommunicates the most important noble there, and then he declares a crusade. Now, many of the French nobles that join this really just want to increase their land power. That's just to be honest, that's what they're doing. But the same privileges promised in the other crusades, that your sins could be forgiven, or your time in purgatory shortened, were promised here for attacking fellow Christians, even though some of them, I guess, would be heretics. During this crusade, southern France will see the Albigensians as well as the Waldensians largely wiped out. So it does eliminate the heretics out of southern France, but it also destroys southern France in the process. And also historically makes the French king's power begin to slowly increase. All right, you can go to the next slide. All right, and the next one. All right, in 1215, Pope Innocent calls the Fourth Lateran Council. This is probably one of the most important councils in church history, but definitely in the Middle Ages. It seeks to, now I know we've seen a lot of corruption that we've not liked. It does seek to make some very basic steps to making moral reform amongst the clergy. Okay, they're not allowed to attend certain theatrical performances or go on hunts or certain games. Okay, stay away from worldly things. They're not allowed to charge at least excessive prices for sacraments or giving you come to the priest for certain burial rites or things like this. They're not going to charge exuberant rates and things like this. The Cathars and Waldensians are condemned here. Now, important theologically, in 1215, this is when the Roman Church says, what's going on when we take the Lord's Supper is transubstantiation. What's happening is essentially this. When the divine miracle happens, usually when the priest holds up the host, what happens to the bread and to the cups, so the wine and the bread, they literally become the body and the blood of Christ in the form of bread and wine. So what you eat is literally the body and the blood of Christ. So that is where this is finally and first kind of formulated. It's taught before this, but this is when the church takes a stand on it. Okay. Another thing, Jews in Christian cities wear special clothing to identify as Jews. Now I know this seems maybe a little too far or something like this, but the medieval church or medieval society was very insistent on if you were a former heretic or you'd done certain things, you wore certain things to identify that way. This just adds the Jews onto this. It's said so that people wouldn't marry them not knowing they're Jews, but I figure you would. If you're going to marry somebody, you know that beforehand. Maybe not. But nonetheless, they wear special clothing to identify themselves, as well as would heretics and others who engage in certain things. Repentant heretics, I should say. Another thing, all Christians must confess their sins once a year, very importantly, to their own parish priest. Many people would rather just confess, if they were going to the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, for instance, rather than their own priest. And they must receive Holy Communion at least once a year. Many people did not. We'll talk more about this later. All right, we can go to the next slide. And the next one. All right, well, we probably don't have time to talk about this. I think I can pick it up somewhere else. So let's just we'll end here and we'll take questions. We only got about 3 minutes. So any questions? Okay, well, if no questions, just a preview of what's coming. Next week we're going to look just at theology. We've looked at the last several lectures, kind of these big flyovers of the history that's going on, theologically, to some extent politically, kind of in the church as well. What we're going to do next week is we're going to take one lesson and we're going to look at some of the trends of theology going on. And then the next lecture, we'll look at the late Middle Ages and really going to be the lesson that sets us up for the Reformation. Okay, there's a lot going on right before the Reformation happens. A lot of these themes that we've been seeing will kind of begin to get worse or culminate or grow exponentially to some extent, and will lead us into the Reformation. And I think it will help you understand why the Reformation happens a lot better. I know some of this stuff may not seem all that important, but it all, in some way, does eventually tie in and prepares for things that do come later. All right, well, you are dismissed.